On the feature film side, and there's different career paths depending on what type of medium you're working in, whether it's feature film or television. There was an opening on John Wick 2, and I interviewed for it. I ended up getting the job, and so I worked on the John Wick universe and the John Wick movies. When they shoot them in wider angles so that you can see everybody, and you can see that we are not hiding anything, and you can see that it is Keanu that is actually doing the fighting. I think a lot of people don't realize exactly how much the movie that comes out in theaters is the movie that you, the editor, create. So, not every movie can you just start taking scenes from the beginning and put them at the end or the middle, and Birds of Prey, though, is one where it's just every piece is kind of up for grabs. You're choosing the performances, you're choosing the timing, you're choosing the pace of the cuts. In many cases, you're making decisions about the music and the look and the sound and all of these things that make the movie that people see.
Try and do the same.
I'd say I was in college when I sort of realized this was a thing that I wanted to do. I went to USC Film School, and I interviewed for film school and got into it while I was also working at Stan Winston's studio doing tech support and whatever else they would let me do. Kind of through a combination of working there during a time in the Stan Winston studio history when they were starting to get into visual effects, and they had an Avid and they needed a visual effects editor, and also being at USC and going through the classes where they have you do everything. You write, you direct, you shoot, you do sound recording, casting, you do everything. And so you get a really good exposure to all the different crew positions. And I found that I gravitated more, or I enjoyed editing the most out of all of the positions that I was exposed to. So it was a little bit of a dual track thing where like college gave me exposure to editing my own films, and then Stan Winston gave me exposure to being a visual effects editor. When I graduated from USC, I was still working at Stan's, but I stayed there only about another year, and then decided this is something that I want to do, and pursued editorial positions on the production side.
What did you learn at film school, and how did that set you up for this career?
Film school is like a little bit of a hot debate topic, and I had a great time at film school. I loved all of the people that I met at film school. You have a great network that many people that I'm still in touch with who I went to film school with. In terms of like a specific thing that you learn that you take into your career, that's a little harder to pinpoint. I mean, hopefully, if USC is doing their job, they're grounding all of their graduates, in an appreciation of cinema and a history of cinema, so that when you go out into the world and you pick your job in this industry, you go into it with an understanding of what came before you, what the state of the industry is now, and you can better interact with and talk story and art and style with the other people that you're going to be working with. One of the things that film school didn't do was actually prepare me for a low end post-production assistant or really more assistant editor job, because that's just not something that they focus on. And would that have been useful? Yes. I think it would have been great if USC had prepared us a little bit more for the actual types of jobs that, that a new 22-year-old kid is going to get right out of college. I had a great time there.
What are those jobs? How does that progression typically work from someone who's just starting their career editing to editing their own features?
So on the feature film side, and there's different career paths depending on what type of medium you're working in, whether it's feature film or television, or music videos or commercials or trailers or, all the things that are out there to edit these days. For feature films, because that's basically what I've focused on, a lot of people start as a post-production assistant, which, is often someone who, is a little bit of a runner and a assistant around the office in terms of like getting lunches and doing errands and making sure that the office itself and everybody that's working there, is comfortable and has everything they need, and that the deliverables and the materials that go in and out of an editorial office get, from point A to point B. I did a little bit of a post-production assistant job on the TV show Criminal Minds, and it involved me basically driving in my car all day long across LA every day. There were two of us, and we delivered something like 100 and some odd DVDs. This is dating me, but delivered 100 and some odd DVDs, all across town to executives at different, studio lots. And so that was actually not a great post-production assistant job, because I was spending so much time in my car that I didn't get any actual exposure to the editors and the assistant editors all day long. And so I didn't stay there very long. It was only 3 or 4 months. Since though I had started my my career at Stan Winston Studio in college, I was lucky enough to already have union hours by the time that I graduated. So I didn't. Most people will do a whole feature or two as a post production assistant, and then if you're lucky, you get an opportunity to become an apprentice editor, which is a union position. And one of the biggest barriers you face early on is getting into the union. So if you can get an apprentice editor position, which is something that a lot of us are pushing more and more for, then you've really kind of landed a great opportunity and you're well on your way. Another way that people get into the union is they go into reality television, where you can work non-union as an assistant editor. And once you rack up, I think it's something like 100 days or something like that of paid assistant editor work that's non-union, that qualifies you to join the union, and then you can go back on the feature side and look for people who will hire you as an assistant editor.
What changes once you join the union? Why is that so important?
Well, if you want to work on any of the big, work for any of the big studios or networks, they've all signed union contracts. So the thing that changes is that you get access to those jobs. If you are like, when I'm crewing up and I'm hiring, assistant editors and apprentice editors and second assistant editors and all these kind of things, I can't hire someone who's not in the union. So getting in the union is a big first step to getting the types of jobs, if you want to work in features and television, the types of jobs that you're after.
And so apprentice editor is that very first entry point.
Yeah, apprentice editor is the first entrance point. A lot of people skip it and go directly to assistant editor, because for various reasons it was really hard for a long time to hire apprentice editors, and so not many people did it. And we editors had a very frustrating experience where we would hire post-production assistants who were great, and we would give them that exposure to being in a feature editorial department and show them the ropes and get to know them, and then not be able to bring them on to the next show in an editorial position. And you don't want to keep somebody in a post-production assistant position too long, because that's just then they're just stuck. So many people will go the reality route, or go the route that I did. I got my 100 days non-union, and then I came in under an assistant editor classification, and then eventually worked my way up to editor.
Got it. If you were starting today with this goal of becoming a feature film editor, where would you start? What might you do differently from what you did do?
I got pretty lucky, so I'm hesitant to say that I should have done anything differently. Things worked out pretty well early on. I just, I lucked into a job on Pan's Labyrinth, and into another job, as assistant editor for a guy named Sean Albertson, who kept, carrying me on to many of the films that he worked on, and then ultimately ended at Bad Robot, again, through just sort of, luck and happenstance. But, these days, one of the things that I've always believed is that if you want to do features, you should look for feature jobs. If you want to do television, you should look for television jobs. And so as much as possible, knowing that everybody's situation is different and everybody's career path necessarily is different, the general advice I give is to try not to deviate from the medium you want to work in as much as you can. So obviously some people are going to have to go the reality route and work in reality television, even though they're dying to be in narrative features. You won't be able to do much about that. If that's the opportunity that you've got, that's the one you've got to take. But if you are given a choice between two opportunities, and one of them isn't a feature, and for whatever reason it pays less, or it's slightly less desirable, or something, there's some short-term property of that job that makes the feature job, a little on paper less interesting than another job that is in TV or like music videos or commercials, stick with the feature job, because that's where, once you get your toe in the door and you start making, those networking connections, things really progress pretty quickly. And the further you stray away from that, the harder it is to get back. So I always give people that advice of just like, if you know what your focus is, then aim for that.
I actually interviewed Sean Albertson
Oh, you
for
did?
the show. So yeah,
That's awesome.
Great guy, amazing editor.
Yeah,
How did you
Sean's
meet
amazing.
him?
I met him through one of my coworkers at Stan Winston Studio, and he introduced us. And then I think I did either some like a very very low paying job, or maybe it was a free job for Sean for a couple of weeks, and then we just kept in touch. And when I finished, I think it was when I finished Pan's Labyrinth, I called him, like you do, calling everybody, being like, I'm free, do you have a job for me? And Sean actually did, as a second assistant editor on Rocky Balboa. And so then I was able to hop onto that crew. They were already well through posts, but they had, they had several months to go. And I was able on that job to, show Sean that I was worth keeping. And so Sean and I did Rocky Balboa, and then I did part of Rambo with him and Warrior, and I cut a short that he produced too.
Cool. When you were at Stan Winston, how did you get the Pan's Labyrinth job, and what was that? So, what was your transition from assistant to?
Yeah. Okay. So Stan Winston was essentially my college job, which was pretty great. And I stayed there full time for 1 year after college. I had sort of hit the limit of what I could do editorially there. They're not an editing facility. They and their visual effects division was kind of an experiment. I don't even know if they still have it. So there wasn't really an upward mobility there editorially. So I was like, I knew that I needed to get over to the production side of things rather than the vendor side, which is what a company like Stan Winston Studio, or Stan Winston Digital was. So when I decided to make that transition, I started, pinging everybody that I knew to try to get interviews. The only interviews I was able to find were interviews in television, and I kept getting pushback. They're like, well, you have feature credits from working at Stan Winston, but you've never worked in TV, and things here are so much different, which is just, total BS. But anyway, people love any excuse to say no. So I wasn't able to get assistant editor work on any of the TV shows that I was interviewing at, and I didn't know anybody in features to interview with. So one of the places that I interviewed said, well, why don't you come on as a post PA? You're already in the union, so when one of the assistant editors leaves, because there's usually turnover on the, these TV crews and the assistant editor ranks, once an assistant editor leaves, then we'll promote you. And so I agreed, and I started doing this post PA job that, to be honest, I hated, again, because it was all driving. It wasn't sitting and like actually getting exposure to what people were doing. But I got enough exposure that I was like, okay, I understand how to do a turnover. I understand, how to be a good assistant. A lot of these things that a lot of the work that the assistant editors were doing, I had done before. I knew how to do it. It wasn't new like they were, claiming. And then when an assistant editor did leave, they didn't hire me. They didn't live up to their end of the bargain. They hired somebody new. And so at that point, I started looking for other work. And the Editors Guild had at that point just added a feature to their website where you could list on your virtual resume the languages that you speak. And so I added Spanish, since I had studied abroad twice in college and could speak more than passable but not fluent Spanish. I checked that box, and like a short time later, I got an email out of the blue from a guy I didn't know, who emailed probably like 15 assistant editors, and I didn't know any of them. So I think he must have gone to the union website to find my name, but to this day, I don't really know. Looking for assistant editors for Pan's Labyrinth. They had already shot the movie in Spain, but they were going to edit it in Los Angeles because that's where Guillermo lives. And at least he did at that point. So I replied to that, and I passed the first interview with the post supervisor. And then the second interview was with the editor, which was entirely in Spanish. But when I walked in, I was the third person that they were interviewing, the third out of three people that they were interviewing that day. The first guy didn't bring his resume to the interview. The second guy didn't actually speak Spanish. And so Guillermo's assistant on the way in the door, she sort of whispered to me, she's like, as long as you don't fuck this up, you'll get the job. And so I did the whole interview in Spanish. And then that was actually, at least to Bernat, the editor, that was the last Spanish that he ever wanted me to speak. My first day of work, I started speaking to him in Spanish, and he was like, no. I'm in LA. I want to practice my English. He's like, you can, you'll have to speak Spanish with everybody like we had crew that were in Barcelona and in Mexico City. And, there's just generally a lot of Spanish speakers on a movie like Pan's Labyrinth. He's like, you'll get enough of that there. With me, you speak English. And I was like, okay. So yeah, that's how I ended up at Pan's Labyrinth, and then continued with Bernat and Guillermo both to do Hellboy 2 right afterwards.
Cool. What's it like working with Guillermo del Toro?
Oh, amazing. I love that guy. He is so charismatic. He is so smart. He's so dedicated and passionate and emotional. I feel like I got this masterclass just sitting in the room while he and Bernat were cutting. And he was also very inclusive. He would invite like our crew on Pan's Labyrinth was small. It was just me and Bernat and Guillermo most of the time, in a house that they had rented for Bernat to stay in, because Bernat lives in Barcelona most of the time. So they rented a 2-bedroom house, and Bernat slept in one bedroom, and they put the Avid in the other bedroom. So for the most part, it's just the three of us in a house. And, if they were editing, we had one Avid too that we were sharing. So if they were editing, there was nothing for me to do but sit in the room and, and watch and participate. And so they would ask me right off the bat, they would ask me my opinion. They would ask me, where I would cut time out if there was anything that was confusing. Guillermo's friends would come to lunch, like Alejandro Iñárritu and Alfonso Cuarón. They would come by, and, and Guillermo would just be like, yeah, like normally with directors, it's like, okay, this is where I leave you guys to go have your own lunch somewhere else, and I'm going to go, eat with my friend. But Guillermo was always very inclusive. Like I just learned a ton about like actually putting a movie together and like killing your darlings as you're trying to get time down. And and going for like what's important to keep, even if it runs a little bit long, and like identifying those parts of the story that are extraneous that you can cut out. So yeah, working with him was lovely. And then he moved first to New Zealand for the Hobbit movie that didn't happen for him, and then to Toronto for Pacific Rim, where he still lives. And so one day I hope I can work with him again as an editor, but he has an editor in Toronto, so he would have to move first.
So he's a director who stays in the edit bay. He's very present.
Oh yeah,
during the
yeah. On Hellboy 2, we were shooting in Budapest, and so Bernat and I were out there, and Guillermo would come into the editorial offices at like 7 o'clock every day and spend 3 hours with us. And so he would do a whole day's shoot, getting up who knows how early, and then he would finish the shoot, and then we had to be sure that we were completely ready for him, by about 7 o'clock every day. And so yeah, that he's very involved. And by the time that we finished the shoot, we had a cut of the movie that was much more advanced than most editors' assemblies at that point.
Any other philosophies or lessons that you learned from him working so closely together?
One of the things I learned is you can't bullshit Guillermo del Toro. Sometimes you go to like VFX reviews, or you meet with people in other departments or other vendors that haven't worked with them very long, and they'll try to like slip in something that's like they think is sort of good enough but not perfect, and they know it's not perfect, and he spots that a mile away. And so like being honest. I mean, one of the things about being an editor and being an editorial is that we always preach, we necessarily need to be completely honest, because if we're not honest with our directors and with the producers, and like there's no benefit to trying to be political in that way. It just hurts the movie if you don't like there's no benefit in holding back a harsh opinion of something that's not working in the movie, because then you're just letting something bad in the movie live, or you're letting you're letting your director think that something is good when you think it's really not. Like there's no benefit to that. So but yeah, working with Guillermo, I think, was probably one of the earlier lessons I got in sort of the politics of of that, and of just the importance of like be honest even if you've got bad news.
What was next in your career?
Let's see. So that was 2007. Then Hellboy 2 was like 2000. That was a year. I did a year abroad on that movie. It was 7 months in Budapest, and then we cut in London for 6 months. That took us through 2008. I cut some indie features after Hellboy 2 finished, and waited to take another assistant editor job until I needed the health insurance hours and the money. So that was Warrior in 2009. And then I left Warrior partway through when I got another indie cutting job. I guess that brings us to around 2010.
And so the big studio projects, better pay, better benefits, but less independence, maybe, or how do those compare?
Like as an assistant editor trying to become an editor, it is very hard to become an editor if you haven't actually edited anything. So a strategy that a lot of us use, or used in my case now, is that you do high-paying assistant editor jobs on like big budget features, and then you save money while you're doing that in order to allow yourself time to work for free, or on a something that has a very, very low budget, but that allows you to edit. The studio projects have necessarily, because they have all these departments, and you're a small cog in a big machine, there is, I don't know if there's more oversight, but there's just more things going on. There are more people giving notes. You don't necessarily have to listen to them all, But there's international marketing, which is its own thing. Sometimes there's a soundtrack release. There's all these other things you have to be aware of that are happening in parallel tracks to you. Whereas like, yeah, in an indie movie, you're just hoping that it gets into a festival. So there's nobody that's like preemptively marketing your movie or making a trailer for your movie or creating a soundtrack or, any of these other things that, happen at a big studio.
What's considered high pay for a high paying assistant editor job? And then for editors working on indie films with like let's say a $5 million budget, what would they be paid?
I mean, all of my numbers are out of date now, I think, because it's based on scale. And so, I mean, all I can say is when I was a first assistant editor on like Mission Impossible 4, I was making somewhere in the neighborhood of like $3,000 a week, maybe a little north of that, maybe 31 or 3,200. I think those numbers have gone, I know that those numbers have gone up a little bit just because of inflation and, general wage increases with our contracts. As an indie editor on a $5 million movie, I made about the same, actually. I worked on a $4 million movie called Everly, and I made about, I want to say it was about $3,000 per week on that movie. Generally when you do the indies, you aren't picky about what they pay you. You'll take what they've got in their budget. So I did Everly, and then after that, a few years after that, I did Southside with You, for a third the salary, because I was still trying to like solidify myself as like a full-time editor.
And how were those indie directors finding you, or how were you meeting them?
The first movie I cut, Towards Darkness, that was a college friend of mine, Antonio Negrete. Then I came in halfway through a movie called Peep World, which they found me through a college friend who was like a line producer on their shoot. Then Antonio from Towards Darkness connected me with an actor that he knew named Daniel Gillies. And that was the third movie I cut, which is called Broken Kingdom. That one I essentially did for free. And took, over the course of like 2 or 3 years. And then Everly was an editor that I knew through Sean Albertson, actually, had gotten the offer to cut Everly, but was busy. And I happened to see him on the day he was going to turn it down. And so I was like, dude, like, hook me up. Like, don't just turn it down, redirect it my way. And he did. And so after that, I was able to get a talent agent. And since then, they've, so I'm with UTA as my agency, and they've found me pretty much everything after that.
Cool. What is it like working with an agent?
It's nice. People have different experiences, and a lot of it depends early on, what kind of feedback they get back, the agents get back from you when they pitch you. Like, when you join with an agency, the first thing that they'll do is they'll look at their project list, and then they'll go out to producers with projects available that are looking for editors at roughly your skill and price level, and they will pitch you. And then sometimes they'll get feedback just on your resume when the producer hasn't even met you, but the producer will be like, oh, this resume looks too green. Or then you go in for the interview, and then after the interview, if you got the job, then great, you and your agency are now on a good path together. If you didn't get the job and, they get feedback that's like, again, like, oh, this person doesn't seem quite ready, or something bad, happened in the interview, then the agency, you might find that the agents are like not quite as eager anymore to, to find you work. And so, I know that people have different experiences, even with the same agency, based solely off of those first couple of jobs. Because obviously you're also competing with the other clients at that same agency for the work that is out there. And so for me, I've had a great experience with UTA. I think I've booked everything that I've gone up for with them. We've passed on a couple of projects, but I've done very well in the interviews that they've set me up for. So, that's been encouraging for them to keep putting me up for more and more stuff. If those first interviews hadn't gone as well, maybe the story would have been different.
Who's your agent there?
I have a team of agents, but Mike Ruby is the guy that that found me most of the jobs early on, and now I'm working with another guy named Jason Garber, and they work in the production department at UTA. Pete Franciosa is the head of that department, so sometimes I don't talk to him a whole lot, but sometimes he will jump on a call, like if I booked a big job or something cool happens, I'll hear from Pete. So.
Cool. That's great. I met Pete. We filmed the UTA 20th and 25th anniversary videos that they made. So we got to meet Jeremy Zimmer and a bunch of different agents and get a really interesting perspective of how that business works. At what point should a editor be looking for an agent? What's the best way to make that happen?
I looked for agents multiple times between like 2008 and 2014, when I finally like started with UTA. And those first several times that I went looking, I had plenty of lunches, and then at the end of the lunch, you get an email, or they just be like, "Yeah, the lunch was fun, but we're not ready to hire you yet," or I mean, not really hire you, but we're not ready to sign you yet. And uh, but you want one kind of as soon as you can, because they have all the networks. They know who's hiring. They know where the jobs are. They know about jobs that you wouldn't even think of putting yourself up for. And in terms of going about finding one, referrals are good. I got into UTA. I was talking to UTA and ICM at the same time, and both of those came through referrals from people that I knew, who knew agents there, and were like basically called those agents and be like, "Hey, I know this guy. He's got a bunch of smaller editing credits under his belt. If you're looking to sign new editors, would you meet with him?" And so I just started with that.
What are the other good agencies for editors?
There's a ton. There's like the big agencies like UTA and William Morris and CAA and Gersh. There's a bunch of like specifically below the line agencies, like places like Martha Skouras or Eastern Talent. There's great editors at all different sizes of agencies, so I wouldn't necessarily say that like a big place like UTA is going to be by default better than than a smaller place like Martha Skouras or something like that. It's really just like, who do you vibe with? Who do you trust? And are they working for you? Are they putting you up for things that are challenging and beneficial for your career? And are they getting you pay raises between jobs? Those are sort of the criteria to judge them by.
UTA set you up on the interview for the John Wick films, or
They
how did that
did.
come to be?
Yeah, I was cutting Southside with You. I'd actually just had my first kid, so she was an infant. She was like 3 months old, and Mike called and said that there was an opening on John Wick 2, and I interviewed for it, but I wasn't. They said like you'd have to go to New York for the shoot, and my wife was almost done with her maternity leave, and so I was like, dude, I don't know if I can like go to New York for 4 months for a shoot if my wife has to go back to work. um I'm just like, I can't be on the other side of the country when my kid is so young. And I ended up getting the job, and my wife was able to extend her leave. She basically took 3 months of unpaid maternity leave. I talked to Chad, and they hired me after they'd already been shooting for 10 or 11 days, which was tricky to catch up on, editorially. Just usually as you're working on a movie, especially in a new one where you don't know anybody and you want to make a good impression, you try to like cut every day's worth of daily so that you're always caught up to camera. But when you come in and they've already shot for 2 weeks, that's pretty tricky. Um, but yeah, everything worked out.
What is your role when you're going to set? Are you cutting dailies each day, or how are you involved during production?
Yeah, so I get dailies every morning. After they've shot the pre, the day before, I'll get those dailies. I'll cut them together. As I said, your goal by the end of the shoot is to have everything assembled so that you've cut through all the dailies, you've spotted any problems that might have come up. The benefit to being on location when they're doing all this stuff is that if they missed something, if there was a mistake, if a scene doesn't work, you can tell them that in real time, and they can try to work in a fix into the schedule while they still have everybody there. They still have the crews assembled and the locations organized and the sets and everything like that. They can potentially, not always, but sometimes, go back and and fix a mistake.
How interesting. Did that happen on John Wick 2 or 3? Did you spot things that needed to be shot?
In reshoots, I did. Um, in I was so busy just trying to catch up, to the backlog that they had
Yeah.
started me with, that it took me, I think, about 5 or 6 weeks to catch up fully. I was, I can generally cut a day and a half of daily. It depends on what the dailies are specifically, but like, let's say your average, dailies dump, I can cut about a day and a half's worth of a shoot, per editorial day. So it's obviously like a pretty slow, when you're trying to catch up and you've got a backlog, it's pretty slow to
Yeah.
be able to like get to the point where you've made it through the backlog. Um, So on that one, I wasn't like during production of John Wick 2, I wasn't extremely useful for them in terms of like spotting mistakes because they already would have moved on by the time that I got there. The good thing is that with action and particularly with Chad was a second unit director and a stuntman and a stunt coordinator for many, many years before he became a main unit director. That meant that he was very comfortable with shooting action. And so he actually didn't really need me to show him a cut. He knew on the day whether he got it or not. When you go into reshoots, then it gets a little bit more, then being able to actually be on set sometimes as opposed to being in an office. Being on set can be useful because generally with a reshoot, you're only there a couple of days. So if you don't get it that time, then you're going to be screwed. And so there were a couple of things during our reshoot where I was cutting essentially once they hit stop on the camera, I would get the file and cut the scene together. And there were things that I caught that I was like, this doesn't really work. We should go back and we should get this again.
Oh, cool. Is Chad very hands-on in post?
Yeah. So Chad, I mean, he has his company that he runs, 8711. So his schedule is usually he comes in to 8711 at like 6 a.m. and teaches 2 hours of jujitsu to his crew. And then he'll show up in editorial around 10 a.m., usually limping and sore. But he's gotten all of his energy out, so it's good. Then he just plops on the couch and you start showing him stuff. And then he has his own office and editorial, so he will go take care of other business and other movies that he's, developing, other things that are happening with 8711, and that gives me time to work alone on the things that we've talked about, and then I'll go call him back in.
What have you learned from Chad and other action directors that you've worked with are the keys to cutting good fight sequences and action sequences?
Chad and I talk a lot about trying to make sure that the audience can see everything that they need to see, that they are not confused spatially, they are not confused by the choreography, and they are not inundated with cuts that would otherwise hide the quality of the work that they've put into the choreography and the talent of the stunt people that are doing the action. The John Wick movies, starting with, John Wick 1, which Elizabeth Ronalds daughter cut, through the 2 that I did, and then I'm sure with John Wick 4, which Nate Orloff is cutting, the like whole ethos is to be wide and long, to try not to cut until you have to cut. And so generally the cut points that we talk about and that we plan on are, if something breaks, if there's a flub in the shot somewhere, but that's the best take for other reasons, we'll stay in that shot as long as we can, or until you can no longer see what's happening to the best, if you're no longer in the best angle for what's happening on screen.
When you say you try to stay wide and long, what does that mean?
If you think about like a Bourne movie, Bourne movie has a lot of close-ups in it that are cut very quickly, and that just the act of cutting and being close on something where movement looks faster, gives you a sense of energy, but that energy is entirely fabricated by you, the editor, and by the just the inherent closeness of the shot, that you're given. One of the things and that style is fine, for like The Bourne Identity is a great movie. And, one of the things one of the impressions that can give you though, is that the actors that are on screen are not actually the ones doing the fighting that you're looking at. And so the John Wick universe and the John Wick movies, when they shoot them in wider angles so that you can see everybody and you can see that we are not hiding anything, and you can see that it is Keanu that is actually doing the fighting and actually, getting thrown and actually throwing people and, stabbing somebody with a knife in the eye. Like, you can see that it's him, and we stay long so that you can see that it's not only him, but he's doing these very exhausting routines, these very exhausting fights. And so that like, oh wow, this guy, like, this looks real. This guy put the effort in. We are not hiding anything. It is actually him, doing all of this stuff. So that's what I mean by wide and long. When you don't have an actor like Keanu, then sometimes you shoot wide with a stunt person so that you can't see the stunt person's face. And then you cut in close for a close-up for just key moments to kind of remind the audience like, oh, this is supposed to be this actor. And, nothing against movies that do that. You have to, sometimes you don't have a choice. You don't have an actor that's athletic enough. You don't have enough rehearsal time. It's just, you start putting things together, and that's just the way that, you can make the movie work. But when you're working on a John Wick movie, you have the luxury of not having to do that. And so that's a really valuable thing that we try to preserve, throughout all of the like studio notes processes and audience test screenings and everything. When criticism and notes and changes come in, we try to do them our way rather than sort of doing them to the letter of whatever the note is.
Cool. It seems like Bob Odenkirk does his own stunts in Nobody. Was that the case? It seems like a similar
Yeah, that
cutting
was,
style.
yes, that was very similar. Dave Leitch was a producer on that, and a lot of the stunt crew are 8711 and 87 North, stunt guys. So yes, that was very much made in the spirit of John Wick. I mean, it was even Nobody was written by Derek Kolstad, who was the writer of John Wick.
How did you meet Ilya Naishuller, and what's it like working with him?
So that was Nobody was a movie where they had a cut and it worked, but everybody kind of felt like it could be a little bit better. I happened to be free. I knew Dave obviously from John Wick Land. It was right when the pandemic lockdowns were hitting, and so Dave and Kelly sent me the movie and asked me to take a pass at it. Right in like March of 2020, because all of a sudden their deadlines all went out the window, and they had time and I had time, and so I did a pass at first with Dave and Kelly, and then we showed it to Ilya and we got his feedback, and then Ilya took over from there and changed the things he wanted to change and kept the things that that Dave and Kelly had put in that he liked. And that was an instance. It doesn't always work that way with with a process where the producers get very involved, and then especially when the producers kind of do a version and then the director comes, and weighs in on it. But everybody was so great, and Ilya was so nice and so talented, and just like, it was just like one big, happy crew. And I think that the end result was definitely the best movie that we could get. And, it was so good. And that was a product of, of everybody putting their ideas on the table and picking the best ones.
That's great. A few times in that film, you use these, it's like music-driven montages where the music strongly contrasts the really, like the hyper-violent
Yeah.
action happening. Was that you choosing the music? Was that in the cut that you inherited when you started working on it?
Dave is very, very like musically oriented. So a lot of those songs were Dave's suggestions. And then he and Ilya would get together and, and choose the one that actually made it. But they were working with our music editor. So I would give them, the music editor, a version of the montage, and then they would try a bunch of these songs. And when they picked a song, and then I'd have to modify the montage to match the song. Some of the songs were in the, like, I don't know if they were written into the script, but they were definitely like in Ilya's head from the very beginning, and they lasted all the way through. And then others, came through the process with Dave.
What was editing Birds of Prey like?
That one was interesting. So that was another one where I came in, partway through. They had a cut, but we were trying to get it to be a little bit better and a little bit tighter. Because one of the problems with that movie was there are so many characters, and you had to tell each of the characters' stories and backstories and keep the audience interested up to the point where they all get together and they, where they all basically meet and come together near the end. And the movie is nonlinear. So there's just like, that one was like, you could take a piece of that movie and put it almost anywhere and find a way to make it, fit. But whether it was satisfying was another question. So, not every movie can you just start taking scenes from the beginning and put them at the end or the middle, and Birds of Prey, though, is one where it's just every piece is kind of up for grabs. And so, you can try a million different iterations of it. And that's one of the reasons we came in, was to just, to keep trying versions. And one of the things that we ended up, it's the strategy that we ended up with, which sounds obvious sort of in retrospect, is to start the movie with as much of a chunk of Margot Robbie as we could assemble until something stopped making sense, then go to the other characters, because Margot's on the poster, she's a star, people are coming to the movie to see Harley Quinn. And so rather than trying to spread around the exposition early on and tell everybody's story, you really just need to start with Margot and take Margot's A story as far as we could before getting into the B, C, D, and E stories.
I'd love to finish sort of like how you got from 2010 here, like how you kept getting these great films.
In 2010, a friend of like it was like a friend of a friend um, called me to do. Actually, I guess this was 2009. This guy called me um, to do just a week of work on this movie Dance Flick. And his name was Ben Rosenblatt. He was an executive at Paramount post production. They were cutting Dance Flick on Lightworks, so they didn't actually have any avid editors. And they needed someone to come in and do an online for a screen, basically prep the movie for a screening using Avid. And I'd never worked with Ben before, but we'd gone out socially because we had similar friends, and so Ben called me to do this, and this ended up sort of being an audition gig, to see like, okay, how good is this guy? And then a year later, Ben called me back, and he had left Paramount and was now at Bad Robot, and they were prepping Mission Impossible 4, and he needed a first assistant editor, and so he introduced me to Paul Hirsch, who was the editor on that movie, and then I started at Bad Robot, and I worked. So I did Mission Impossible 4 as a first assistant editor. Then I worked for part of Star Trek Into Darkness, also as an assistant editor, but mostly doing temp sound mixing and editing. And I did like a tiny little bit of work on Force Awakens, and I did some other stuff for Bad Robot that isn't a feature and nobody's ever seen. But I was basically at Bad Robot off and on for about 5 years. In that time, I cut another indie, which I got referred to by, through an editor that I knew. And Everly was in there too. That was like 2014. And so after Everly finished, I stopped taking assistant editor work. And so I stopped. So one of the reasons I didn't work more on Force Awakens was because I had sensed that I was at this point in my career where I needed to focus on being an editor. I ended up finding an agent. This is still 2014. And then they got me this movie Revolt, which we shot in South Africa. And I went to South Africa for 6 weeks. I ended up not finishing that one. I got fired off of that one, as happens actually often to editors.
How do editors get fired?
Editors get fired for all sorts of reasons. If you haven't been fired, if you've been working as an editor for more than a few years and you haven't been fired, you're one of the few. We get fired because the script was badly written. We get fired because an executive woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided that something about this movie didn't work, and clearly the editor is incapable of making it work. Oftentimes they fire us when there is a problem with the movie, but they haven't actually bothered to ask the editor to fix it. They just assume that, well, this is what you've presented to us, so therefore this is what you can do, and you can't do anything else. And so we're going to find somebody who can do some other thing. So that's why it's always like, yeah, if you get fired, it's not personal. And if you take over for somebody who has been fired, it is also not a sign that that person that you were taking over for did anything wrong. But it's a thing it's frustrating, but it's a thing that happens a lot. The other thing is that replacing an editor is essentially a net zero change that you can make to the movie. And so if you are going to, like in the case of Revolt, I got fired, they brought in another editor. That editor didn't cost them any more than what they were paying me. So it cost them nothing to try somebody new. In the end, they did still have to rewrite the third act and go back and, reshoot in South Africa, which is what we were trying to tell them very early on. But, you deal with the cards that you're dealt.
What are the secrets to longevity in the editing career? How do you power through the setbacks like that, and how do you come out ahead?
I mean, I think one of the things is just to realize that everybody knows that editors get fired on a whim. And so, it sucks, but you can rebound pretty fast, and it's not a bad mark on your career. Like there's no one who is ever interviewing for a job and not getting that job because they got fired off of, some previous movie. Everybody understands, from the producer level to the editor level to the executive level to the director level, that sometimes things just happen, personalities clash, you're dealing with somebody who's inexperienced and doesn't know how to interact with an editor. There's any number of reasons. And I think everybody gets that, sometimes it's just a thing that happens and you just move on. The worst thing that you can do is be difficult to work with. So, that type of feedback does travel. through referrals and people in the industry behind your back. You won't be able to know when it's happening. But like when if I'm interviewing with a new director or a new producer, they are for sure going to call people that I worked with before, and that person will tell them, oh yeah, it didn't quite work out in this movie, we had to let Evan go, but he was great and I wish that we could have kept him and you should totally hire him. Or they might be like, that guy was a dick and you should not hire him at all, stay far away. And you're spending so much time in the room with these people, that like nobody wants to hire someone who's difficult.
What makes an editor easy to work with, and what are the traits that leave that a good impression on everyone you work with?
One of the traits that makes an editor easy to work with is not injecting their own emotions and anger, or again, not taking things personally. Like, the editorial room should be calm and steady and even keeled. Other people might bring their drama, and if you have an A-list star producer or something like that, those people might be bringing their personality into the room. But your job is to make the best movie that you can and to try to help your director make the movie that they want to make. It's not really about you, the editor. That's why, like, when you go in an interview and people ask what is your editing style, it's like, well, hopefully my style is your style. Whatever you want your style to be, I will help you execute that. You want to leave people with an image of you that's like, oh, this person, when they pushed back on things, they did it professionally and with a supporting argument. And then when I still said, no, I don't want to do that, they didn't, get all angry and get huffy puffy. They just said, okay. Like, again, it's not you or the editor's movie, it's somebody else's movie. I try to hire nice people who don't get flustered, and who are used to sort of rolling with changes in schedule that come at the last minute, or demands, for, for your time and for changes and for things that you aren't necessarily expecting. If you don't let that stuff get to you, then it keeps the stress level down and it makes people want to work with you again. Because directors especially are usually much more stressed inside than they let on. I mean, sometimes they're stressed in a way that you can see from the outside, but often whatever stress you see on the outside is only magnified on the inside. And so you don't need to put them in an environment where you are adding more stress to that. Nobody likes that.
How is the role of the editor changing, and what skills can people dreaming of careers like yours be working on right now?
I mean, one of the things that has changed a lot, and plenty of people have talked about this over the years, is that the expectation for what a cut looks like and how finished it looks, it keeps moving in the direction of more and more finished. You're no longer just sort of cutting dailies and then somebody else comes in and does the sound, and somebody else comes in and does the music, and somebody else comes in and does the color correction, VFX. You are really, as the editor, responsible for presenting a finished enough temp cut. All that stuff will still happen. Somebody else will eventually do the sound, and somebody else will eventually do the color and the VFX. But producers and to some extent directors are so used to watching temp versions, like rough cuts that look finished, that if you are not one of those people who is doing a rough cut that looks finished, that can be bad. There are directors out there. Chad is one of them. I think I read that Ryan Johnson is another one who, and I know actually that Chris McQuarrie is like this also. Directors that prefer actually seeing a cut that does not have all of the bells and whistles of sound and music attached to it, so that you can judge it. You can judge and edit on the merits of the dailies alone, and then adorn it with sound and music before you show it to an audience. That's certainly easier when you're trying to stay caught up to camera during the shooting process and you're putting your assembly together. It's easier if you don't have to worry about making everything look finished the second that you have done your first draft. But again, it depends a little bit on who you're working with. I usually focus a lot on sound effects, and then music is if I can get music into the cut before the director sees it, great, but I don't tend to worry about it as long as it's not like a montage. And if it is a montage, then I definitely put music in.
Can you tell me how amazing your life is at this point? So if you were to if you were trying to sell the role of a feature film editor to someone considering dedicating their life to this, what would you tell them?
I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize exactly how much the movie that comes out in theaters is the movie that you, the editor, create. I mean, certainly when I talk to people outside the industry who ask me what I do, they're like, "Oh, you just sort of like they shoot the stuff and you just kind of like, you know, like put it all in order." But it like reveals sort of an ignorance about, you don't know what do you mean put it in order? It's like you're choosing the performances, you're choosing the timing, you're choosing the pace of the cuts. You're making, in many cases, you're making decisions about the music and the look and the sound and all of these things that make the movie that people see. So one of the things that's appealing to me about working in features is I'm making this thing. I'm basically the last pair of hands creatively that is on this movie before it goes out worldwide to audiences, and that's pretty fun. You know, I the travel component for me, because I love traveling, is also really fun. That was a thing that I didn't expect when I first got into this, was exactly how much traveling I would be doing. But most movies these days don't shoot in LA; they shoot somewhere else, and even the movies that are low budget often want their editors to be on set with them, and so more often than not, you go places. So like I've been to Vancouver, London, Dubai, Pittsburgh, Skywalker Ranch / Marin County,
South Africa.
South Africa. Thank you. I forgot about that one. Morocco, Rome. You know, it's like I've been around and on somebody else's dime, which is like really the best way to travel.
If it's not too personal, how's the compensation, especially compared to other high level roles on a film?
Compensation is good. It's definitely it's a little bit what you make of it and how hard you push, because you know, I find that sometimes there's a difference when you are negotiating between your standpoint or your perspective and the producers. So some producers' perspectives, at least to me, feels like the producer, feel like it is their job to make sure that you don't get too much of a pay raise too quickly. And my feeling about it is more per budget of the movie. Whereas like if you're asking me to edit $150 million movie, that commands a certain amount of, you know, money. And I would like to get paid what other editors who are editing $150 million movies get paid. And if you want a specific number, then, you know, it can be anywhere like the low end would probably be like $7K a week, and there's editors that are making up to $30K a week. I am not making anywhere near that. But obviously that's still a very, very good salary, even on the low end. It's an excellent salary, even on the low end. And, you know, one of the things that you do have to be careful of when you start talking salary for like big budget editors is that the salaries sound so inflated. The numbers sound so inflated. But, you know, you are making, in some cases, a movie that's going to make $1 billion. So essentially you are fighting for what is your fair share, you know, of making somebody else a absolute boatload of money.
What advice do you have for editors trying to negotiate better pay?
It depends. Sometimes you won't be able to. There was a law that came out in California a couple of years ago that prevents employers from asking how much you made, or otherwise asking people who paid you how much they paid you. And that was great. That puts you on a better footing to be like, forget what I made before. What are you making currently? How big is this project? What is a reasonable salary for an editor for a movie that is, you know, as large as whatever you're making? So then you're not sort of hamstrung by having taken, you know, a discount on the show before, and, you know, and then the producers that you're currently negotiating with finding out about that. In television, there's a lot less wiggle room. Like the rates in television are mostly set. You know, it's like scale plus a few $100s per week.
Does feature editing pay better than TV generally, or
Yes.
or can they be comparable? I see.
Yeah, the upper end of feature editing is so much higher than anything you can get in like network television or cable television, particularly. As I said, streaming is sort of in like a middle ground. But yeah, there's editors making salaries out there that like blow my mind.
Wow. What about the freedom that being an editor affords you in terms of choosing the schedule that you want?
Like a in terms of like a day-to-day schedule?
Day to day, and also over the course of a year. If you want to have 3 months off to be with family, I would imagine you can do that.
No, actually you can't. I mean, you can do it if it's between jobs, but generally once you start a job, you don't usually get a vacation until the job is finished, at least in features. You can negotiate from the outset, you can say, I have this wedding that's in October and I need to take a week off there, and you can tell them that while you're negotiating the deal so that they know and everybody's aware, like, okay, this guy's going to take a week off. But generally the schedules are so, compressed that there is no time to take time off.
You're in that project in the thick of it. How intense is it? And what's that day-to-day schedule like?
So yeah, day to day, it depends what part of the process you're in. If you are in production, then your day to day schedule is really on you. How long does it take you to cut dailies together and get all your work done for the day? Most directors don't really check in with their editors during production. They're too busy shooting and dealing with all the problems that come out, when you're shooting. So yeah, for the most part, you can come in whenever you want to come in. You can leave whenever you want to leave, as long as you're sending cuts, to your director, when they expect them, and everybody knows that, you're getting the work done. When you start, after you wrap, then you go into director's cut, which is a 10-week period where you and the director make the movie the director wants to make. And the studio is not allowed into the cutting room at that point, like by DGA contract. So that is generally actually a pretty relaxed period, but it's a little bit, you are no longer setting the schedule, your director is setting the schedule. And some directors are, like Chad, they come in at 10, they look at things, they give you notes, and, you talk about what you're going to do, and then they disappear, and then they come back, and they disappear, and they come back, which is the way that I prefer working. But other directors that, are less busy or more post-oriented will come in and just sit down on the couch, and they won't leave for 10 hours, and so you're just beholden to, the schedule of that person. Once you get past director's cut, you show the studio, and they give you notes, then you start doing preview screenings, or if you're lucky, then you just go straight to like final mix and finishing, and that is generally crunch time, no matter what the size of the project is. There's just so much going on. There's so many more people working on the movie at that point that, and all of them need to be fed with your, your materials. So there's just there's like a lot of things coming in and going out from the editorial department, and a lot of processes that are happening at the same time. So even if you're not actually editing as much, you're usually still really busy, and you're supervising and giving feedback on work that other people are doing, like sound and picture and VFX.
Who are the working editors today that you find most interesting?
I've been fortunate to get to know Eddie Hamilton, who is currently cutting Mission Impossible 7 and 8 and did Top Gun last year, or 4 years ago, but it just came out last year. So, Eddie Hamilton is a guy that I, am friends with and look up to and admire. Joe Walker is also an editor that, I think works on like really interesting stuff, and I would love to work on half of the things that he cuts. Marianne Brandon is an editor that I worked with at Bad Robot, and she is so talented. The editors that you work with as an assistant have like an outsized influence, on your career. It's like Paul Hirsch did, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Carrie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Ray, Mission Impossible 1 and Mission Impossible 4. Like, watching that guy cut, is really a treat. Yeah, I don't know. It could go on. You sort of learn something from everybody. And then when we all get together at like the Ace Holiday Party and you put faces to names, it's pretty fun. You're like, oh, that's that person. I really like that movie that they cut this year.
What are the qualities that set those top editors apart from everyone else?
Just storytelling talent a lot of times, of thinking outside the box. Stephen Marioni is another, like, I mean, he's obviously a very, famous, well rewarded awarded editor, but one of the things I've heard about him is that he'll just comes in, he'll come in one morning and just be like with an idea that like nobody else could have thought of, and just try sort of like wacky stuff, and you try the wacky stuff and 90% of the time it doesn't work, or maybe there's a kernel of something that does work but most of it doesn't work, and then sometimes you get lucky and you try something wacky and the whole thing works. I think it's a combination for those top editors of being fun to work with so that people want to hire them again, being like undeniably talented in terms of, how they tell the story and prioritizing what's important to tell in the story. And then also being able to handle when things go awry, when the story doesn't work out the way that everybody thought in advance. And, because they say the movie gets written 3 times, when it's actually written on the page, when it's shot, and when it's cut. So, editing is the last part of that. And by the time that you get there, so many other decisions and realities of shooting on set, have come into play that you might end up with something that doesn't actually do what anybody imagined it was going to do when they wrote the script in the first place, and being able to sit there and help fix it, is a really valuable skill.
Awesome. And finally, what are you working on now? What can we look forward to?
I'm currently working on The Marvels for Marvel, and you can look forward to it in about 6 months. I think it comes out the end of July.
Awesome. That was great.
Thank you.